The island seemed rich, alive, and full of promise. Yet hunger followed the ship. On Mallicolo, the crew learned that abundance does not always mean generosity. Voyage to go, history. Life is a journey, being part of it is everything. Hello, my name is Jessica. In this podcast, I explore historical journeys and travel accounts that shaped how Europeans came to understand the world. This series follows the second voyage of Captain James Cook and the young naturalist Georg Forster through the Pacific in the 18th century. In this episode, the voyage leads to Mallicolo, an island where survival follows rules the Europeans do not yet understand. What happened in the last episode? In the previous episode, the Resolution anchored off Ambrim and made its first close contact with the islanders. Initial signs of peace gave way to tension, misunderstandings, and gunfire, followed by a fragile reconciliation. Encounters revealed sharp cultural differences, linguistic isolation, and a society both curious and cautious, as exploration, trade, and botanical research unfolded under constant uncertainty. Tuesday, July 19, 1774, Aurora Island, Vanuatu.
Once the commotion had passed, the woodcutters returned to their work. The islanders watched them with great admiration for their skill. A few women now appeared as well, though they still kept some distance from the marked boundary. The women were small and of a very unflattering appearance, the most unpleasant Georg had seen so far in the South Seas. The older ones, presumably married, wore short pieces of cloth or matting material that reached from the hips to the knees. The others wore nothing but a cord around the waist, from which a small bundle of straw hung like an apron, covering the bare minimum. Children, regardless of gender, ran about completely naked up to the age of around 10. Some of the women had dusted their hair with yellow turmeric powder. Others had smeared their faces with it, and still others had rubbed it over their entire bodies. Against their dark skin, this created a bright and unattractive contrast. But on the island itself, this was likely considered beautiful. Tastes differ greatly from one culture to another. This yellow paint, if one can call it that, seemed to be the only form of adornment the women used. They wore no earrings, necklaces, or bracelets. Such decorations appeared to be reserved for the men. Where that is the case, women are usually held in low regard and live in complete dependence. That seemed to be true here as well. The women carried large bundles on their backs and often lugged more than one child with them, which looked pitiful given their already frail build. The men showed no respect toward the women, did not allow them to come closer, and the women themselves were so aware of this restriction that they would run away immediately whenever someone from the crew approached.
In many Polynesian and Melanesian societies, women played a central role as mothers, gardeners, artisans, and guardians of tradition. Their responsibilities were often clearly separated from those of men, but not necessarily considered of lesser value. Power and influence depended greatly on the specific cultural context. A comparison between Tahiti and Vanuatu during James Cook's second voyage around the world in the 1770s reveals particularly striking differences, which Georg Forster and other European observers also noted. In Tahiti, women, especially those of noble lineage, could hold significant social influence. They took part in ceremonies, could inherit property, and were regarded as equal conversational partners. Their sexual autonomy was emphasized, though it was governed by taboos and ritual regulations. Forster was impressed by their presence, their education, and their openness in interaction. In Vanuatu, by contrast, society was more strongly patriarchal. Men dominated public life, particularly in religious and political spheres. For instance, in men's houses or ritual rank systems. While women were indispensable in everyday life, they were generally excluded from decision-making processes and sacred spaces. Forster described them as friendly and helpful, but far more reserved in the public sphere. Even during the second voyage, a clear contrast emerged. In Tahiti, women were visible and influential. In Vanuatu, they remained confined to familial and economic roles. European travel accounts reflected these differences with curiosity, but also through the lens of their own cultural assumptions.
Around midday, most of the gathering dispersed, likely to eat. The chief invited the captain to his shelter in the forest, but the invitation was declined. After a short stay, they returned to the ship around 1 o'clock, together with Georg and the others. The islanders let them leave without interference, though they remained gathered on the beach until the ship was reached. The French navigator Bougainville had not fared so well on the island of the outcasts. There, the people had acted friendly only until his men got back into their boat, then fired a volley of arrows after them. Bougainville's crew responded with a musket volley, hitting several of the attackers. Since these islands lie very close together, and Bougainville had visited only a few years earlier, it was possible the locals had already heard of the Europeans' superiority, and were now behaving more cautiously because of it. Right after lunch, the captain and Georg's father went ashore on the north side of the harbor to retrieve the anchor buoy, which the islanders had stolen and, as seen through the spyglass, dragged off in that direction. During all this time, not a single islander appeared on the southern beach of the harbor, where they had landed in the morning. But from the forest, they often heard pigs squealing, indicating the island was well stocked with them. As soon as their boat put off, several islanders came out to the ship in their canoes to trade. Until late in the evening, they brought bows, arrows, clubs, and spears for sale, giving them up in exchange for small pieces of cloth. Their canoes were no more than 6 meters long, poorly made, without decoration, but equipped with outriggers or counterweights. Altogether, only 14 boats were counted, suggesting that this people was not particularly devoted to fishing. The captain and Georg's father returned to the ship before sunset. The islanders had allowed them to take the anchor buoy back, without interference. Some parts were missing, but easily replaced. The people in this part of the harbor immediately began to trade with them, but wanted only to sell weapons and ornaments. For these, they accepted only trifles of little value. One older woman gave up her nose ornament, 2 semi-transparent, wedge-shaped pieces of selenite, tied together with grass fibers at the ends. Though the ornament had previously adorned her wide, black-painted nose, she parted with it without hesitation. The crew tried to obtain food and provisions, but despite their efforts, the islanders brought nothing of the sort to trade. Their goods seemed more valuable to them than what was offered in return. Everywhere, food was the true wealth of a people, and here too, fertility revealed itself in how much they were willing to give away. The men climbed up to the tip of the harbor and discovered an enclosed plantation with banana trees, breadfruit, coconut palms, and other crops. Not far from it stood a few shabby huts, palm leaf roofs resting on posts so low that one could not stand upright beneath them. Pigs and some poultry wandered through the grass nearby. The few people who lived there showed little surprise at the presence of foreign visitors and seemed less curious than those they had met that morning. Although they did not appear pleased that the captain had come so close to their homes, they showed no open hostility. From the huts, the men walked out to the furthest point of the headland. From there, they could see 3 islands to the east. The locals told them the names. The largest, with the volcano, was called Ambrim, the one with the pointed mountain, Pauhum, and the southernmost, Apaya. They also pointed to the headland where the men stood and gave the name of their own island, Mallicolo. This name closely resembled the Vanuatu mentioned by Captain Quiros about 160 years earlier in his travel account. Since Quiros had never actually visited the island himself, but only heard the name from other islanders, it was quite possible that it was the same place. The discovery of the name Mallicolo was significant for the expedition. This was also reflected in a small observation. On the way back, someone found an orange on the beach, a sign that Quiros's reports of the island's fruits were credible. If he had been right, there was much to hope for from Mallicolo, as he had described it as especially rich in natural resources. They showed the orange to the islanders, who immediately gave its name. While they had found pomelos on the Friendly Islands, this was the first orange discovered on any South Sea island. The captain had the boat rowed another 3.7 kilometers into the harbor. At the very innermost end, the shore was covered in mangroves. No fresh water could be found, although a stream likely flowed into the sea through the trees. The mangroves formed a dense tangle of roots and hanging branches that produced new trunks without ever separating from the main tree. Because of the day's heat, the group returned to the ship in the evening exhausted. On the way back, they heard drums and saw people dancing by their fires on the beach. The music wasn't particularly harmonious or varied, but livelier than what they had heard on the Friendly Islands. That night, they tried their luck fishing, with good results. A shark, about 2.7 meters long, was especially welcome, as they had only a few yams left, which they ate in place of bread. Another sailor caught a remora nearly 60 centimeters long, and a third landed 2 large red sea breams, probably Sparus erythrinus. One of the fish was shared at the sailors' table. The other was gifted to the officers. The captain received a portion of the shark, which made for a welcome treat the next day. For once, the entire crew had something fresh to eat. Shark meat was no delicacy, but better than the usual salted meat, and in times of need, they even found it tasty. For need, that stern teacher can make whale blubber a delicacy to Greenlanders, or tripe to the Khoikhoi. When the shark was opened, they found the bony tip of a poisoned arrow deeply embedded in its head. It had pierced clean through the skull bone. Yet the wound had healed so well that there was no sign of injury on the outside. Some wood and coconut fiber still clung to the arrowhead, but both were so rotted that they crumbled at the slightest touch. It seemed that the supposed poison of these arrows was by no means deadly to fish. The following morning, they raised anchor and departed the island. During their brief stay, they had scarcely been able to sketch the harbor. According to astronomical observations, it lay at 16 degrees 28 seconds south latitude and 167 degrees 56 seconds east longitude, and was named Port Sandwich. Before reaching the reef belt, the wind died down. They had to launch the boats and tow the ship out, which they eventually managed with considerable effort. The islanders took advantage of the delay and came once more in all 14 outrigger canoes, bringing more weapons to trade for Tahitian cloth, which they clearly prized. Again, the crew requested food, but just like the day before, the islanders refused to part with any. They only traded items they could easily spare or replace with little effort.
Again and again, the crew tried to obtain food, and again, they failed. To European eyes, the refusal was difficult to understand. The island appeared fertile. Pigs and poultry were present. Crops were growing. Why, then, would people trade weapons and ornaments, but not food? In many island societies, food was not simply a commodity, it was security. It represented survival beyond the present as part of their protection against storms, droughts, illness, or failed harvests. To give food away meant to accept risk, not only for oneself, but for one's family and community. Exchange with strangers followed different rules than exchange with the group. Ornaments, weapons, or crafted objects could be replaced with time and labor. Food could not. Once consumed, it was gone. Offering required trust, long-term relationships, or ritual obligations, none of which yet existed between the islanders and the crew of the Resolution. European travelers often misread this distinction. They assumed that visible abundance meant surplus, and that fertile land guaranteed generosity. But subsistence economies worked with narrow margins. What looked like plenty could disappear quickly after a storm, a poor season, or conflict. Seen from this perspective, the behavior of the people of Mallicolo appears neither hostile nor irrational. They traded what they could afford to lose and protected what they could not. Food, in this sense, was the true measure of wealth, and the one thing they were unwilling to risk for curiosity or short-term gain. With this in mind, the continued reluctance of the islanders to part with food appears in a different light, and the events that followed can be understood as cautious, deliberate choices rather than acts of ill will.
By midday, they had finally cleared the harbor and, with the help of a rising sea breeze, began moving away from Mallicolo. Their next destination was Ambrim, the island where they had seen a smoking volcano. Whether they might have obtained food if they had stayed longer or established better relations was difficult to say, but probably not, for the islanders had no understanding of the usefulness of iron tools, and the sailors had no other goods to offer in trade. Mallicolo was about 37 kilometers long from north to south. The harbor where they had anchored lay on the southeastern tip. In the interior, very high, forested mountains rose up, likely the source of good springs and streams, although their course could not be followed due to the dense mangrove forest. The soil in the explored areas was rich and as fertile as on the Society Islands. Since the neighboring island of Ambrim had an active volcano, it was reasonable to assume that there were signs of volcanic activity on Mallicolo as well. The plants seemed to thrive particularly well in the local soil and climate. They were highly diverse, and the useful species were in no way inferior to those found on other South Sea islands. Coconuts, breadfruit, bananas, yams, taro, turmeric, and oranges had all been traded there. The names of these fruits had also been learned from the locals. The domesticated animals consisted of pigs and chickens. With their arrival, that group was expanded as they left behind a pair of young dogs from the Society Islands to breed. The islanders were delighted by the animals, but gave them the same name they used for pigs: bruas. So, dogs were clearly an entirely unknown species to them. No other four-legged animals had been seen during their short stay, and it was unlikely that such creatures existed on this remote island at all. On the other hand, the forests were home to many different bird species, some of which were probably still unknown to the naturalists. A more thorough investigation of the island's flora and fauna had not been possible, as they had spent only a single day there, and most of that at the rather unproductive shoreline. The natural products of this land did not seem nearly as strange at first glance as the inhabitants themselves. Judging by the number they encountered at Port Sandwich, the overall population appeared to be fairly large. But relative to the island's size, it could not yet be considered densely populated. Georg estimated that 50,000 people would be the maximum possible figure. Unlike Tahiti, where the people lived mostly along the coast, here they were scattered across more than 1,550 square kilometers. Mallicolo was, in essence, one vast forest, with only a few areas cleared and cultivated. These inhabited spots lay scattered within the dense jungle like small islands in the wide South Sea. If the mystery that shrouded the history of this people could ever be lifted, it would likely become clear that they arrived in the South Seas later than the inhabitants of the Society or Friendly Islands. One thing was certain: they must have had a completely different origin, as shown by their physical features, language, and customs. In many respects, they resembled the people of New Guinea or Papua. Their skin was just as dark, and their hair just as woolly. If the climate truly had the effect that Count Buffon claimed, then their settlement on the island could not have occurred long ago, for neither their black skin nor their curly hair had changed under this milder climate. Georg himself, however, did not believe in such a sweeping influence of climate, and mentioned this hypothesis only in passing. He would have been ready to discard it in favor of another, more plausible explanation. Unfortunately, New Guinea and the surrounding islands, the only regions whose study might provide clarity, were still barely known, at least in terms of their peoples. The few travelers who had reached those places reported only that New Guinea was inhabited by more than one ethnic group. It was particularly noteworthy that, in addition to dark-skinned people, there were also lighter ones, whose customs suggested kinship with the inhabitants of the Society and Friendly Islands. Furthermore, there was said to be a third group, possibly resulting from the mixing of the other two. In their slender body shape, the people of Mallicolo could be compared to the inhabitants of Australia, but in all other respects, they differed entirely from them. One peculiar and, as far as Georg knew, entirely unique custom of this people was to bind the lower abdomen tightly with a cord, so tightly that anyone not accustomed to it from childhood would have suffered great discomfort, or perhaps even lasting harm. The cord used was about the thickness of a finger, and left a deep groove above the navel, so that the lower torso appeared divided into two separate parts. The upper arm was similarly constricted with a very tight armband, presumably for the same reason as the abdomen. These bands had no doubt been worn from youth and grown into as part of their development.
The tight cords worn around the abdomen and upper arms struck Georg Forster as unnatural and troubling. To him, they appeared to restrict physical growth and hinted at hardship or deprivation. But practices of body modification were neither rare nor exceptional in human societies. They were widespread, meaningful, and deeply embedded in cultural life. Across the world, people have shaped their bodies to express belonging, endurance, beauty, or status. Binding, scarification, tattooing, tooth modification, and even the shaping of skulls were not acts of cruelty, but long-established traditions learned gradually from childhood. What felt shocking to an outsider was often experienced as normal, familiar, and even desirable by those who grew up within the practice. European observers, however, tended to interpret such customs through their own medical and moral frameworks. They search for explanations in climate, scarcity, or physical degeneration, rather than asking how these practices functioned within the society itself. Forster hesitated. He suspected necessity, habit, and tradition rather than deliberate self-harm, and he did not rush to a final judgment. In environments where food resources were limited and physical labor demanding, controlling body shape may also have had practical meanings. Tight bindings could support the body during work, protect sensitive areas, or simply persist through generations until they became ornament as much as function. What becomes visible here is an early moment of ethnographic reflection. Forster does not fully understand the practice, but he resists the temptation to dismiss it as mere barbarism. Instead, he records what he sees, aware that meaning lies not in appearance alone, but in the lived experience of the people themselves.
Though their facial features were highly unattractive, they showed much liveliness, alertness, and a look of quick comprehension. In the lower part of the face, particularly the lips, they differed markedly from Africans. The upper part, especially the nose, was more similar in shape. Their hair was just as curly and woolly. The flat forehead might not have been natural, but shaped by the mother's hands, since a newborn's head can be molded into many forms. On the American mainland, for instance, there were peoples who tried to shape their children's heads after the form of the sun, moon, or other symbols. On Mallicolo, however, the flattening of the forehead was not taken so far as to exceed the already striking irregularities of the face. The climate on this island and the surrounding ones was very warm, though likely not as evenly mild as in Tahiti, given that Mallicolo was much larger. Nevertheless, during their short stay, Georg had no reason to complain about excessive heat. The thermometer showed between 24 and 25 degrees Celsius, 76 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit, which, in tropical latitudes, was still fairly pleasant. In such a climate, people had no need of clothing, and wearing any would have been pure luxury. But the inhabitants were not yet prosperous enough for that. The dense forests that covered nearly the entire island provided ample protection, both from the vertical heat of the sun's rays and from rough weather. The genitals were the only part of the body they covered, most likely for purely practical reasons, to protect those sensitive areas from injury in the thorny, brush-filled forests. That this protection was the primary purpose of the covering could be seen in its upward-facing shape. Modesty seemed to play no role in this. Chastity and shame were, after all, mere results of education, not innate ideas, as people often mistakenly believed. Among all uneducated peoples, there was clear evidence that modesty and chastity were entirely unknown virtues in a natural state. As mere social conventions, they took on different forms everywhere, depending on the level of societal development. Judging by the local sense of decency, the men of Mallicolo had likely not invented their peculiar covering to prevent indecent thoughts. In fact, its shape seemed more likely to encourage such thoughts than to suppress them. Likewise, with the women, it remained uncertain whether the shabby straw bundle they wore as an apron was worn out of modesty or out of a desire to please. By contrast, ideas of beauty seemed much more widespread and deeply rooted in human nature, even if they differed greatly between cultures. The man of Mallicolo believed he made himself beautiful with a stone in his nose, a bracelet, a necklace, and a glossy black paint. His wife, however, was not allowed to wear any ornaments at all. As far as could be observed, the women had to make do with covering their bodies in yellow turmeric powder, which gave off a distinctive aromatic scent. On the Friendly Islands, the same powder was used as a hairdressing, and on Rapa Nui, women used it to paint their faces and clothing. But that may have been less for fashion than for some useful property attributed to the substance. Tattooing, which was widespread among other lighter-skinned peoples of the South Seas, appeared to be entirely unknown on Mallicolo. Their diet consisted largely of plant-based foods, as they practiced real agriculture. From time to time, they would treat themselves to a pig or a chicken, and the sea must also have contributed to their sustenance. Even though no fishing gear had been seen, the existence of boats suggested that fishing was not neglected. Their tools could not be studied closely during the brief visit, but judging by the construction of their boats and huts, they did not appear to be particularly skilled craftsmen. The soil seemed good and fertile, but since the island was almost entirely forested, clearing enough land for sustenance must have been very laborious, especially because the cultivated plants had to compete with the rapid growth of weeds. Perhaps they bound their bodies with cords and armbands in order to restrict physical growth and thus survive on less food. At the very least, it seemed reasonable to think that only necessity could have led to such an unnatural practice. Later, it may have persisted out of habit and eventually come to be seen as ornamentation. The time they had to devote to fieldwork apparently left them with no leisure to make proper clothing. Besides, they had little need for it, and it was known that a love of rest and idleness were common weaknesses among small, uncivilized peoples. They rarely worked willingly, and only when necessity compelled them. Part of their time was spent on music and dance. Their instruments were, as expected, very simple. Beyond drums, nothing else was heard. But drums, like whistles, are usually the first invention of the human mind. In the monotony of domestic life, people seem to seek compensation through movement, artificial sounds, and the exertion of the voice, almost as if to achieve something extraordinary by it. The people of Mallicolo used their drums not only for entertainment, but also as alarm signals in emergencies. It was likely that they often clashed with neighboring island communities. There were probably also disputes among themselves, as they lived scattered across the island in separate family groups. They carried their weapons at all times and never laid them aside. Only the few who entered the captain's cabin appeared unarmed. They seemed to invest more effort and craftsmanship into making their weapons than any of their other belongings. The bows were sturdy, made of elastic wood, and smoothly polished. The arrows, especially the poisoned ones, were finely crafted and even adorned with small decorative pieces. This practice of poisoning the arrows was a sign of their intelligence. Revenge and fear of oppression may have driven them to this tactic. It was probably necessary to compensate for their lack of physical strength, for they were rather slightly built. Whether the arrows were truly poisonous, however, could not be confirmed. A dog, which they tested upon arrival, recovered, even though it had also eaten a poisonous fish at the same time. Later they tried it again on another animal. A small cut was made on its hip. The scraped resin, believed to be poison, was sprinkled into the wound, and everything was bandaged. The dog limped for a few days, likely due to swelling and the tight dressing, but eventually recovered. The inhabitants of Santa Cruz, or Egmont's Island, who, according to Captain Carteret, had killed several members of his crew, seemed in many ways similar to the people of Mallicolo. According to his report, the bows and arrows there were longer, and the tips made of flint instead of bone. But those arrows, too, were said to have been poisoned. Quiros, who discovered Santa Cruz, also claimed that the inhabitants there, as well as those in St. Philip's Bay on St. Jago, poisoned their arrows. Yet the examples he cited in support of this accusation seemed no more convincing than the experiments with the dogs. Georg had previously noted that the people of Mallicolo used a kind of wooden cuff to protect themselves from the snap of the bowstring. Since they never took it off, it seemed they must use the bow frequently. They also carried spears, or throwing spears and short clubs, likely reserved for close combat. Given the number of weapons, one might have assumed a warlike disposition. Yet they behaved peacefully overall toward the crew, albeit cautiously. Now and then, one could detect hostile or suspicious expressions on their faces, but that may have stemmed from worry or uncertainty. That they did not ask the Europeans to stay was understandable, for they had come to see them as powerful and threatening. Such an intimidating presence could hardly be welcome. Little could be said about the system of government upon first impression. Georg could only speculate. They seemed to remain constantly alert and must have frequently come into conflict. For that, they would have needed leaders, to whom they, like the Maori of New Zealand, likely submitted, at least in times of war. The only man Georg took to be a commander was the one who had ordered that they be given water. Only in that instance did he show signs of having some authority among his people. In appearance, however, he was indistinguishable from the rest. Their religion remained entirely unknown, as did their domestic life. Whether they suffered from illnesses was also unclear. None of the visitors encountered anyone who appeared sick. According to Bougainville, however, the inhabitants of a nearby island were said to be so severely afflicted with leprosy that he had named their land the Island of the Lepers. The character of the people of Mallicolo had to be understood in the context of their stage of social development. They lived divided into many small groups and individual families scattered across the island. This made it easy for disputes to arise. It was therefore no surprise that they behaved cautiously and at times mistrustfully in every situation. Yet they were by no means quarrelsome. On the contrary, they showed in their dealings with the foreigners that they preferred to avoid conflict. They even reacted with annoyance when one of their own did something that could endanger the good relations. They frequently offered green branches, which were generally recognized as a sign of friendship. The gesture of pouring water over one's head also seemed to carry that meaning. This further supported the suspicion that these people were related to those of New Guinea, as Dampier had observed the same custom on Pulo Sabada, on the west coast of New Guinea. In personal interaction, they showed great ability to learn. They were quick-witted and both willing and able to develop their understanding. The inhabitants appeared to take great delight in dancing and thus seemed cheerful and lively by nature. It likely would not have been difficult to raise their level of civilization. Georg believed that an ambitious man from among their own people could have achieved this using their own resources.
This brings us to the end of this episode of The Journey. You can continue listening right away as the voyage unfolds step by step. If you'd like to follow the route on a map or see how these places look today, you'll find links in the YouTube show notes leading to the website. If you enjoy the podcast and would like to support my work, you'll find a PayPal link there as well. Because life is a journey, being part of it is everything.